She was off the clock sipping coffee when a seal at table 3 triggered the code. Sarah Martinez had always found comfort in the familiar rhythm of her evening routine. After 12 grueling hours at the trauma center, she would drive the 15 minutes to Danny's diner, order her usual black coffee, and sit in booth 7 where she could watch the world slow down through the rain-streaked windows. Tonight was no different except for the unusual quiet that had settled over the usually bustling establishment. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah wrapped her fingers around the warm ceramic mug, letting the heat seep into her palms. Her scrub still carried the faint smell of disinfectant and the weight of the day's emergencies. 3 car accident victims, 2 heart attacks, and 1 gunshot wound that had kept the entire trauma team on edge for 6 hours straight. Dr. Rebecca. Chen had finally called it at 11:47 p.m., but Sarah's mind was still replaying every crucial moment, every decision that meant the difference between life and death. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the messages from her sister Emma, who was worried about her working too, many double shifts. Emma didn't understand that being a trauma nurse wasn't just a job for Sarah. It was a calling that had chosen her rather than the other way around. Ever since that night 15 years ago when she was 17 and her father had collapsed from a massive heart attack, Sarah knew she wanted to be the person who could make a difference in those critical moments when everything hung in the balance. The diner's bell chimed as the door opened, bringing in a gust of cold October air that made Sarah shiver despite her thick cardigan. 3 men walked in, their movements precise and purposeful in a way that immediately caught her attention. They weren't the usual late-night crowd of truckers, insomniacs, or hospital workers grabbing a quick bite. These men carried themselves differently, with a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the space around them without effort. The first man was tall and broad-shouldered, with graying temples that suggested he was in his 40s. His eyes swept the diner methodically, taking in every detail from the emergency exits to the positioning of other customers. Behind him, 2 younger men followed, both athletic and alert. One had sandy brown hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled at Dolores, the night waitress. The other was darker, more serious, with tattoos visible on his forearms that disappeared under the sleeves of his black t-shirt. They chose table 3, directly in Sarah's line of sight, and she found herself observing them with professional curiosity. In her line of work, she had developed an ability to read people quickly, to assess their condition and state of mind in seconds. These men were clearly military, probably special forces given their bearing and the way they communicated with subtle glances and minimal words. The sandy-haired one caught her looking and offered a polite nod before turning his attention back to his companions. They spoke in low tones, occasionally glancing at phones and checking the time. Sarah couldn't make out their conversation over the soft jazz playing through the diner's old speakers, but their body language suggested they were waiting for something, or someone. Dolores approached their table with menus, but the older man waved them away and simply ordered 3 black coffees. Sarah smiled to herself, recognizing kindred spirits who understood that sometimes coffee was less about the caffeine and more about having something to hold while your mind processed the events of the day. She returned her attention to her own coffee, now lukewarm, and thought about calling Emma back. Her sister had left 3 voicemails, each one more concerned than the last about Sarah's well-being. Emma worked in marketing for a tech company in Seattle, a world away from the life and death decisions that Sarah faced every shift. She meant well, but she couldn't understand why Sarah pushed herself so hard, why she volunteered for the most difficult cases, why she stayed late to check on patients even when her shift was over. The truth was, Sarah thrived in chaos. While others crumbled under pressure, she became more focused, more capable. It was during those moments when everything was falling apart that she felt most alive, most useful. Tonight's gunshot victim, a 19-year-old kid caught in the crossfire of a gang dispute, had reminded her why she chose this profession. When his blood pressure dropped and his heart nearly stopped, Sarah had been the one to spot the internal bleeding that the initial assessment had missed. Her quick thinking and calm action under pressure had given the surgeons the extra time they needed to save his life. These were the moments that kept her going through the exhaustion, through the emotional toll of losing patients through the bureaucratic frustrations of working in an understaffed hospital. Every life saved was a victory against the randomness and cruelty of the world, a small way of making sense of her father's death and her own survival. The men at table 3 were still waiting, their coffees growing cold as they maintained their quiet vigil. Sarah wondered what brought them to Danny's diner at this hour. Military personnel often found themselves in odd places at strange times, following orders that civilians couldn't understand. She had treated enough soldiers over the years to recognize the signs of men who had seen combat, who carried invisible wounds alongside their visible scars. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Please call me. I'm worried." Sarah typed back, a quick response promising to call tomorrow, then slipped the phone into her purse. She loved her sister, but tonight she needed the solitude, the quiet space to decompress from another day of holding lives in her hands. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the windows with increasing force. The weather report had predicted a storm, and Sarah hoped it wouldn't affect her drive home. Her small apartment was only 10 minutes away, but the winding road could be treacherous in heavy rain. She finished her coffee and signaled Dolores for the check, ready to head home to a hot shower and hopefully a few hours of dreamless sleep. Tomorrow would bring another shift, another set of emergencies, another chance to make a difference. As she gathered her things, she glanced once more at table 3, where the 3 men continued their patient wait for whatever mission had brought them together on this stormy October night. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison checked his watch for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. The operation was scheduled to begin at precisely 0200 hours, which gave them another 40 minutes to wait. He hated the waiting. After 12 years as a Navy SEAL, he had learned to manage the adrenaline, to channel the nervous energy into focused preparation, but the anticipation before a mission still made his jaw clench with tension. His teammates, Petty Officer First Class Miguel Santos and Petty Officer Second Class Tyler Reed, sat across from him at the small diner table, their own ways of handling pre-mission stress evident in their quiet rituals. Santos methodically cleaned his fingernails with a small knife, a habit he had developed during his first deployment in Afghanistan. Reed stared out the window at the storm, his fingers tapping a silent rhythm against his coffee cup that Jake recognized as the beat of his daughter's favorite lullaby. The target tonight was a warehouse complex on the outskirts of town, where intelligence suggested a human trafficking operation was preparing to move a group of kidnapped women across state lines. The FBI had requested SEAL support due to the suspected presence of armed guards with military training and the time-sensitive nature of the situation. 23 women and girls, ranging in age from 16 to 34, were being held, in conditions that the briefing materials had described as deplorable. Jake's mind automatically shifted into tactical mode, reviewing the building schematics they had memorized, the entry points they had identified, the communication protocols that would keep his team alive. The warehouse had 3 main entrances, 2 loading docks and a skylight that could provide emergency extraction if everything went sideways. Local police would establish a perimeter, but the actual rescue operation would be carried out by Jake's team, working in coordination with FBI Special Agent Maria Vasquez, who was currently conducting final surveillance from a vehicle parked 2 blocks away. The woman in booth 7 caught his attention again. She had been there when they arrived, sitting alone with a cup of coffee and the kind of tired expression that Jake recognized in his own mirror after difficult missions. There was something about her bearing, the way she held herself, that suggested she was accustomed to stress and responsibility. Her scrubs marked her as medical personnel, probably coming off a long shift at the regional hospital. Jake had developed an instinct for reading people during his years in special operations. It was a survival skill that had kept him and his teammates alive in hostile environments around the world. This woman had the same quality he had noticed in combat medics and field surgeons, a calmness that came from repeatedly facing life-and-death situations. She moved with efficiency and purpose even in simple actions like lifting her coffee cup or checking her phone. "Commander, you're staring," Santos murmured without looking up from his nail maintenance. Despite his casual tone, his voice carried the easy familiarity of men who had saved each other's lives on multiple occasions. Santos had been Jake's point man for the last 4 years, and they had developed the kind of wordless communication that made them exceptionally effective as a team. "Just staying aware of our environment," Jake replied, though he knew Santos was right. Something about the nurse had captured his attention beyond simple operational awareness. Maybe it was the way she seemed completely comfortable with solitude, or the gentle competence visible in her smallest gestures. In Jake's experience, people who worked well under pressure often shared certain traits, regardless of their profession. Reed's phone vibrated against the table, and he glanced at the message before showing it to Jake. Agent Vasquez was confirming that the targets were still in position and that the local tactical team had completed their perimeter setup. The warehouse showed signs of activity, with guards rotating on a predictable schedule that would give them a 12-minute window to make their approach. The mission briefing had emphasized the psychological trauma that the rescued victims would likely be experiencing. Many had been held for weeks or months, subjected to physical and emotional abuse that would require extensive medical and psychological treatment. The FBI had arranged for a team of counselors and medical personnel to be standing by at a secure location, but the initial moments after rescue would be critical for establishing trust and ensuring cooperation. Jake thought about his sister Katie, who worked as a social worker in San Diego. She had helped him understand the long-term impact of trauma, how people could carry invisible wounds for years after the physical danger had passed. Katie had explained that sometimes the kindness of strangers in those first moments of freedom could make the difference between healing and a lifetime of fear. The rain outside continued its steady assault against the diner windows, creating rivulets that distorted the neon signs of the businesses across the street. Weather conditions would complicate the operation slightly, reducing visibility and making movement more difficult. But Jake's team had trained extensively in adverse conditions. If anything, the storm would provide additional cover for their approach. Dolores refilled their coffee cups without being asked, her experienced eye recognizing customers who were settling in for a longer wait. She had worked the night shift at Danny's Diner for 15 years and had learned not to ask too many questions about the unusual groups that sometimes found their way to her tables. Military personnel, police officers, emergency workers, and others whose jobs kept them moving through the night all appreciated a quiet place to gather their thoughts and prepare for whatever lay ahead. The woman in booth 7 was preparing to leave, gathering her purse and jacket with the same efficient movements Jake had noticed before. She left exact change on the table along with a generous tip, another sign of someone who understood the value of service work. As she stood to go, their eyes met briefly, and Jake saw a flash of recognition in her gaze. Not recognition of him, personally, but acknowledgement of a kindred spirit, someone else who carried weight and responsibility as part of their daily existence. She nodded politely before heading toward the door, her steps steady despite what had clearly been a long and difficult day. Jake found himself hoping that whatever challenges had brought that tired look to her eyes would resolve themselves, that she would find the rest and peace that people in high-stress professions rarely got enough of. Santos was watching him with an amused expression. "You know, Commander, when this mission is over, you could always come back here and see if she's working another night shift." Reed chuckled softly. "Santos is right. When was the last time you took leave that didn't involve visiting your parents or helping your sister move?" Jake smiled despite himself. His teammates knew him well enough to recognize when something or someone had captured his interest beyond the normal bounds of operational awareness. They also cared enough about his well-being to encourage him to pursue connections outside their tight-knit military community. Agent Vasquez's next message indicated that it was time to move into final position. Jake felt the familiar transformation as his mind shifted completely into mission mode, pushing aside all distractions to focus on the task ahead. 23 women were depending on his team's training and expertise to bring them safely home. Everything else, including the intriguing nurse from booth 7, would have to wait. Sarah had just reached her car when the first explosion shattered the quiet night. The sound rolled across the industrial district like thunder, followed immediately by the sharp crack of automatic weapons fire. She froze with her key halfway. "To the lock?" her trained instincts immediately identifying the sounds of violence and chaos erupting somewhere in the darkness beyond the diner's parking lot. Her phone buzzed with an emergency alert from the hospital's trauma center. Mass casualty. Event. All available medical personnel report immediately. The message sent a familiar surge of adrenaline through her system, the same heightened awareness that kicked in whenever lives hung in the balance. Sarah didn't hesitate. She turned around and ran back toward Danny's diner, knowing she would need to coordinate with emergency services and possibly set up a triage station until ambulances could navigate the storm and reach the scene. Inside the diner, chaos had erupted. The 3 military men from Table 3 were already on their feet, speaking rapidly into communication devices while Dolores and the handful of other late-night customers huddled near the kitchen. The older man, clearly the leader, was barking, orders in the clipped, efficient tone Sarah recognized from her work with military medics during disaster training exercises. Santos, establish communication with base. Reed, get these civilians to the back of the building and keep them there until we know what we're dealing with, the commander was saying as Sarah burst through the door. His eyes locked onto hers, immediately, and she saw a flash of recognition followed by quick assessment. Ma'am, you need to get to safety. There's an active situation developing in the area. I'm a trauma nurse from Regional Medical, Sarah said quickly, pulling out her hospital identification. I just got called back for a mass casualty event. What's happening out there? The commander's expression shifted as he processed this information. In the span of seconds, Sarah watched him evaluate her potential usefulness against the danger of involving a civilian in an active operation. She had seen the same calculation in the eyes of emergency room doctors who had to decide whether to risk a dangerous procedure that might save a patient's life. Commander Morrison, he said, extending his hand in a brief handshake. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, U.S. Navy SEALs. We were conducting a rescue operation at a warehouse facility when things went sideways. Multiple hostiles with military-grade weapons, and we have casualties among both our people and the victims we were trying to extract. Another explosion lit up the night sky, closer this time, and the diner's windows rattled in their frames. Through the glass, Sarah could see the orange glow of fires burning in the warehouse district. The sound of sirens was growing louder as emergency services tried to navigate the storm-slicked roads, but she knew from experience that it would be at least 15 minutes before the first ambulances arrived. How many casualties? She asked, her mind already shifting into triage mode. Morrison hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing operational security against the immediate need for medical assistance. Potentially 20-plus victims, mostly women, who have been held in captivity for weeks or months. Unknown number of injuries, but we know several are in critical condition. My teammate Santos has a gunshot wound to the shoulder, and Agent Vasquez from the FBI is trapped in the warehouse with at least 3 civilians. Sarah's training took over completely. She turned to Dolores, who was standing behind the counter, with wide, frightened eyes. I need clean towels, all the ice you have, and anything that can be used as bandages. Tablecloths, napkins, anything cloth. Can you do that? Dolores nodded and immediately began gathering supplies while Sarah pulled out her phone and called the trauma center directly. Dr. Rebecca Chen answered on the first ring. Sarah? I thought you went home. We got the alert about a situation in the warehouse district. I'm at the scene, Rebecca. I need you to send every available unit and tell them to bring extra blood products and surgical supplies. We're looking at multiple trauma cases, possible malnutrition and dehydration, and at least one GSW that I know of. The access roads are compromised, so they'll need to stage at the intersection of Industrial and 5th. While she spoke, Morrison had returned to his communication with what sounded like a tactical operations center. The other SEAL, Reed, was helping Dolores gather medical supplies while keeping watch on the other customers who had taken shelter in the diner's back room. Ma'am, Morrison said when he finished his call. I can't ask you to put yourself in danger, but we have people who need medical attention that we can't reach safely. If you're willing, we could use your help stabilizing casualties until proper medical evacuation can be arranged. Sarah looked at him steadily. In her 12 years, as a trauma nurse, she had never turned away from someone who needed help, regardless of the circumstances. The Hippocratic Oath wasn't technically binding for nurses, but the principle was the same. First, do no harm, but also, do everything possible to preserve life when it was threatened. What do you need me to do? Morrison's relief was visible. Santos is mobile but needs that shoulder looked at. More importantly, we have civilians trapped in a safe room in the warehouse who were injured during the initial extraction. Agent Vasquez is with them, but she's FBI, not medical. We can get you there safely, but once we're in, you'll be working in a combat zone until backup arrives. The rational part of Sarah's mind cataloged all the reasons this was a terrible idea. She wasn't military trained, she had no protective equipment, and she would be placing herself in the middle of an active firefight. But the larger part of her mind, the part that had chosen trauma nursing as a calling, was already calculating what supplies she would need and how to prioritize patients based on the limited information available. I'll need a first aid kit, whatever supplies Dolores can gather, and a way to communicate with the incoming medical teams, she said. And I want to speak to Agent Vasquez directly to get an assessment of the casualties. Morrison nodded and handed her a tactical radio headset. Within moments, she was speaking to FBI Special Agent Maria Vasquez, who was indeed trapped in a reinforced storage room with 7 rescued victims. 2 women had serious injuries from their captivity. One was showing signs of severe dehydration and possible cardiac stress, and a third had been wounded when the shooting started. Agent Vasquez, this is Sarah Martinez, trauma nurse from Regional Medical. I'm coming in with the SEALs to provide medical support. I need you to tell me exactly what you're seeing with each patient. As Vasquez described the conditions of the trapped women, Sarah felt her professional calm settle over her like armor. This was what she did best, what she had trained for through years of education and experience. The location might be unusual, but the fundamental challenge remained the same. Keep people alive until they could receive definitive medical care. Morrison was watching her with an expression of professional respect that she recognized from working with military medics and emergency responders. He had evaluated her credentials and found them sufficient for the task at hand. More importantly, he had recognized in her the same commitment to service that drove his own dangerous work. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I want you to know that once we go in there, things could get very dangerous very quickly. If I tell you to take cover or evacuate, you need to follow that order without question." Sarah nodded, understanding that accepting his authority in tactical matters was the price of admission to help the people who needed her skills. She had worked with enough military personnel to know that their chain of command existed to keep everyone alive, and she respected that structure even if it wasn't part of her civilian world. Outside, the sounds of battle continued, punctuated by the growing wail of approaching sirens. Sarah gathered the medical supplies that Dolores had assembled and prepared to follow Commander Morrison into the most dangerous situation of her career. The warehouse complex was a maze of smoke, shadows, and danger. Sarah followed Commander Morrison and his team through a series of service corridors, her medical bag clutched tightly against her chest as they moved toward the safe room where Agent Vasquez and the rescued victims were trapped. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic scent of blood, creating an atmosphere unlike anything she had experienced in her years of hospital work. Morrison moved with fluid precision, his weapon ready but controlled, communicating with his team through hand signals that had been perfected through years of dangerous operations. Reed and Santos flanked their small group, their eyes constantly scanning for threats while maintaining a protective formation around Sarah. Despite Santos's shoulder wound, he moved with barely a hint of discomfort, his training and adrenaline overriding the pain. The tactical radio crackled with updates from the FBI command post. "Team Alpha, we have visual on 3 hostiles moving toward your position from the east corridor. Local SWAT is 10 minutes out. Repeat, 10 minutes until backup arrives." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady. This was different from the controlled chaos of the trauma center, where the dangers were medical rather than physical, where the enemies were time and injury rather than armed criminals. But the fundamental mission remained the same: preserve life, stabilize patients, and buy time for definitive treatment. They reached the reinforced storage room where Agent Vasquez had taken shelter with 7 of the rescued women. The heavy steel door was locked from the inside, and Morrison spoke quietly into his radio to announce their arrival. Sarah heard the sound of furniture being moved, and then the door opened to reveal a scene that broke her heart and steeled her resolve simultaneously. Agent Maria Vasquez was a compact woman in her 30s with intelligent dark eyes and blood on her FBI jacket. She had been using her first aid training to tend to the wounded, but Sarah could see immediately that the situation was beyond basic field medicine. The 7 women huddled in the small space ranged in age from late teens to early 30s, and their physical condition told the story of prolonged abuse and neglect. "Thank God," Vasquez said as she recognized Morrison. "We've got multiple medical emergencies here, and I'm running out of options." Sarah immediately began her assessment, her training allowing her to triage the patients even in the dim emergency lighting. The most critical case was a young woman named Carmen, probably in her early 20s, who was showing signs of severe dehydration and possible kidney failure. Her skin was ashen and cold to the touch, her pulse rapid and thready, and she was drifting in and out of consciousness. The second priority was an older woman named Elena, who had sustained a bullet wound to her thigh during the initial rescue attempt. Agent Vasquez had applied pressure and managed to stop the external bleeding, but Sarah could tell from the patient's pallor and vital signs that she was likely bleeding internally. "I need to get an IV started on Carmen immediately," Sarah told Morrison while she worked. "She's in hypovolemic shock, and without fluid replacement, she's going to go into cardiac arrest." Morrison nodded and positioned himself near the door, maintaining watch while Sarah worked with the efficiency of someone who had performed these procedures thousands of times under pressure. The other women watched with a mixture of hope and fear, their trust in rescuers complicated by weeks or months of trauma that would take years to heal. As Sarah inserted the IV catheter and began fluid resuscitation, Carmen's eyes fluttered open. She tried to speak, but Sarah gently placed a hand on her forehead. "You're safe now," Sarah said in both English and Spanish, recognizing from the woman's features and the name Vasquez had used that she might be more comfortable in her native language. "My name is Sarah, and I'm a nurse. We're going to take care of you." The tactical radio erupted with urgent chatter. "Multiple hostiles approaching the east entrance. Team Alpha, you need to be ready to move in 3 minutes." Morrison made a quick decision. "Agent Vasquez, how many of these women can walk unassisted?" 4, maybe 5 if we help the others," Vasquez replied. "But Carmen can't be moved in her current condition, and Elena shouldn't be walking on that leg wound." Sarah looked up from her patient. "I need at least 20 minutes to stabilize Carmen enough for transport. Elena needs a surgical repair that I can't do here, but I can control her bleeding temporarily." "We don't have 20 minutes," Santos said from his position at the window. "The bad guys are regrouping, and they know we're here." Sarah's mind raced through the options. In the trauma center, she had resources, equipment, and backup. Here, she had improvised supplies and was working in conditions that would have been unthinkable in any normal medical setting. But the principle remained the same. Do whatever was necessary to keep the patient alive. "Commander, I can stabilize them for transport, but I need you to buy me 10 minutes, she said. "Can you do that?" Morrison's eyes met hers, and she saw the same calculation she had witnessed in the diner. He was weighing the risks to his team against the lives of the women who depended on them for survival. Santos, Reed, defensive positions. Agent Vasquez, help the nurse with whatever she needs. We hold this position for 10 minutes. Then everyone moves together. As gunfire erupted again in the distance, Sarah worked with focused intensity. She established a second IV line for Carmen, administered medications to support her blood pressure, and created a makeshift splint and compression bandage for Elena's leg wound. The other women, despite their own trauma and exhaustion, helped by holding supplies and providing comfort to the most seriously injured. One of them, a teenager named Rosa, spoke English well and served as a translator for Sarah's instructions. Despite everything she had endured, Rosa maintained a quiet dignity and strength that reminded Sarah why she had chosen her profession. In the worst circumstances, people often revealed their best qualities, finding reserves of courage and compassion that they never knew they possessed. Morrison appeared at Sarah's shoulder. "How much longer?" 2 more minutes, she replied, checking Carmen's pulse and blood pressure. The IV fluids were helping, but the young woman was still critically ill and would need intensive care as soon as they reached the hospital. "Ma'am, I need you to know that our exit route is going to be dangerous. We'll have cover from SWAT teams, but there's going to be active gunfire. Can your patients handle being moved under those conditions?" Sarah looked at her two most critical patients. Carmen was more stable than she had been 10 minutes ago, but still extremely fragile. Elena was alert and determined, the kind of person who would push through pain to reach safety. Carmen can be moved if we keep the IV running and support her airway. Elena can walk with assistance, but someone needs to monitor her for signs of renewed bleeding. The others should be able to move quickly. The sound of approaching helicopters cut through the night air, and Morrison smiled for the first time since Sarah had met him. "That's our cavalry," he said. "SWAT air support and medical evacuation. We're going to get these women to safety." As they prepared to move, Sarah realized that her life had been fundamentally changed by this night. She had always known that medicine was her calling, but working alongside these dedicated professionals had shown her new dimensions of service and sacrifice. Commander Morrison and his team had risked their lives to rescue strangers, just as she had chosen to risk her safety to provide medical care in a combat zone. The door opened, and they began their careful movement toward safety and medical care, carrying with them not just the rescued women, but a shared understanding of what it meant to serve others when everything was on the line. The medical evacuation helicopter touched down in the hospital parking lot, just as dawn was breaking over the city. Sarah had spent the entire flight monitoring Carmen's vital signs while paramedics worked on Elena's leg wound. The young woman had stabilized during transport, but Sarah knew the next few hours would be critical for her recovery. Dr. Rebecca Chen met them at the trauma center doors with a full medical team. "Sarah, what do we have?" "Female, approximately 22 years, old, severe dehydration and malnutrition, possible renal failure," Sarah reported as they transferred Carmen to a hospital gurney. "She's received 2 liters of normal saline and is responsive to verbal stimuli, but she needs immediate blood work and likely dialysis consultation." The trauma center erupted into controlled activity as medical teams dispersed to care for the 7 rescued women. Sarah found herself automatically falling into her familiar role, coordinating care and ensuring that each patient received appropriate treatment for both their physical injuries and the psychological trauma they had endured. "Commander," Morrison appeared at her elbow as she finished giving report on the last patient. His uniform was torn and dirty from the night's operation, and she noticed a fresh bandage on his left arm that hadn't been there before. "How are they doing?" he asked, his voice carrying the exhaustion that Sarah recognized in herself after particularly difficult cases. "Carmen is going to need several days in intensive care, but I think she'll recover fully with proper treatment. Elena is headed to surgery for her leg wound, but the vascular surgeon thinks she'll have complete function afterward. The others are stable, mostly dealing with malnutrition and the effects of prolonged stress." Morrison nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Agent Vasquez wanted me to thank you personally. She said your intervention probably saved at least 2 lives tonight." Sarah felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and humility that came after successfully treating critical patients. This case had been unlike any other in her experience, but the fundamental reward remained the same. People who had been dying were now going to live. "What happens to them now?" she asked, watching as psychiatric social workers began the delicate process of providing support for the rescued women. "FBI Victim Services will coordinate their care and help reunite them with families where possible. Some of them have been missing for over a year, so there's going to be a long process of recovery and reintegration." Morrison paused, studying her face. "What you did tonight was extraordinary. I've worked with military medics in combat zones, and you performed at their level under conditions that would have challenged experienced battlefield personnel." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Compliments from patients and their families always meant more to her than recognition from hospital administration. But hearing approval from someone who had seen real combat was particularly moving. "I just did what any nurse would do," she said. "When people need help, you help them." "No," Morrison said firmly. "Not everyone would have made the choice you made tonight. You left safety to enter a dangerous situation because strangers needed your skills. That's not just professional competence, that's courage. Dr. Chen appeared at Sarah's shoulder with a cup of coffee and an expression of bemused pride. Sarah, I need to ask you something. How exactly did you end up in the middle of a FBI raid last night? Your official shift ended at 11, and the next thing I know, you're calling from a combat zone requesting multiple trauma teams. Sarah and Morrison exchanged a look that contained the shared understanding of people who had been through an intense experience together. I was having coffee at Danny's diner when the situation developed, she explained. Commander Morrison and his team needed medical support, and I was available. Rebecca shook her head. Only you, Sarah. Only you would end up volunteering for a SEAL mission during your coffee break. Despite her teasing tone, Sarah could see the respect in her colleagues' eyes. Rebecca understood better than most the split-second decisions that medical professionals had to make, and she knew that Sarah's choice had been both dangerous and necessary. Morrison pulled out his phone and checked the time. I need to report for debriefing, but I wanted to ask you something first. He seemed suddenly uncertain, the confidence that had carried him through the night's operation replaced by something more vulnerable. When this is all over, when the paperwork is done and these women are safe, would you be interested in having dinner? Somewhere without emergency situations or combat zones. Sarah smiled, feeling something warm and hopeful flutter in her chest, despite her exhaustion. I'd like that, Commander Morrison. Jake, he said. When I'm not leading rescue operations. I'm just Jake. Sarah, she replied. When I'm not treating patients in warehouses, I'm just Sarah. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who had found each other in the midst of chaos and recognized something worth pursuing. Around them, the trauma center continued its vital work, caring for the women who had been given a second chance at life through the combined efforts of law enforcement, military personnel, and medical professionals. Agent Vasquez approached them, with a cup of coffee and gratitude written across her tired features. I wanted to thank both of you before I head back to the field office. The Bureau is going to want detailed reports, but I wanted you to know that the human trafficking ring we broke up last night was responsible for kidnapping women across 3 states. The intelligence we gathered is already being used to identify other operations. Morrison nodded. Any word on the suspects who got away? Local police have roadblocks set up and we're coordinating with Border Patrol. The operations leadership was taken into custody, so even if some of the foot soldiers escaped, the organization itself has been dismantled. Vasquez turned to Sarah. I've been doing this for 8 years, and I've never seen a civilian step up the way you did last night. The FBI would be honored to have you as a consultant for future operations involving medical emergencies. Sarah was surprised by the offer, but also intrigued. Her work at the hospital was fulfilling, but the events of the past night had shown her that her skills could be valuable in situations she had never considered. I'll definitely think about that, Agent Vasquez. Thank you. As Vasquez headed back to her duties, Sarah realized that her sister Emma had been trying to reach her all night. Her phone showed 17 missed calls and twice as many text messages, progressing from concern to panic as the hours passed without response. She quickly typed a message explaining that she was safe and would call later with details. Jake was watching her with an expression of understanding. Family worried about you, my sister. She thinks I work too hard and put myself in dangerous situations. Sarah paused, considering the irony. I guess last night proved her point. Or it proved that you're exactly the kind of person the world needs more of, Jake replied. People who are willing to take risks to help others, who don't look for reasons, not to get involved when someone needs help. Dr. Chen returned with an update on Carmen's condition. She's responding well to treatment. Her kidney function is improving, and we expect a full recovery. Elena is out of surgery and doing well. The surgeon was able to repair the vascular damage completely. Sarah felt the tension she had been carrying finally begin to ease. In the trauma center, success was measured in lives saved and families reunited. Tonight had been a complete success, by those standards, even if the circumstances had been extraordinary. Jake's phone buzzed with what was clearly an official message. I really do need to get to that debriefing. he said reluctantly. But I meant what I said about dinner. When would be good for you? Sarah thought about her schedule, about the double shifts she routinely worked, and the way she filled her off time with additional training and volunteer work. For the first time in years, she found herself wanting to make space for something purely personal. I'm off this weekend, she said. Saturday night? Saturday night sounds perfect. Jake smiled, the expression transforming his face from the serious military commander she had first met to someone she could imagine laughing with over a quiet meal. I'll call you Friday to work out the details. They exchanged phone numbers with the slightly awkward formality of two people who had been through an intense shared experience, but were now returning to the normal world where relationships developed at a more conventional pace. As Jake left for his debriefing, Sarah finally allowed herself to acknowledge her exhaustion. She had been running on adrenaline and professional training for nearly 8 hours, and the crash was beginning to set in. Dr. Chen noticed her fatigue and officially ordered her to go home and sleep. And Sarah, Rebecca added, as she prepared to leave, take tomorrow off. You've earned it, and I suspect you're going to need time to process everything that happened. Sarah drove home through the morning rush hour traffic, her mind replaying the events of the night. She had always known that her medical training could save lives, but she had never imagined using those skills in a combat zone alongside Navy SEALs and FBI agents. The experience had shown her new possibilities for service, new ways that her expertise could make a difference in situations beyond the hospital walls. More importantly, it had introduced her to Jake Morrison, a man whose dedication to protecting others matched her own commitment to healing. Their meeting had been orchestrated by chance and circumstance, but Sarah had learned to trust that the most important connections in life often happened when and where you least expected them. As she finally reached her apartment and prepared for a well-deserved rest, Sarah realized that her routine evening at Danny's diner had changed the trajectory of her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. 3 months later, Sarah found herself once again sitting in booth 7 at Danny's diner. But this time she wasn't alone. Jake Morrison sat across from her, sharing coffee and conversation that had become a cherished part of their Saturday evening routine. The diner held special significance for both of them as the place where their paths had first crossed, though they had discovered many other restaurants in the city that served as venues for their growing relationship. The rescued women from that October night had all made remarkable recoveries, both physically and emotionally. Carmen had indeed required several weeks of intensive medical care, but she had returned to full health and was now working with a victim advocacy organization to help other survivors of human trafficking. Elena had regained complete function in her leg and was pursuing a nursing degree, inspired by the care she had received during her rescue and recovery. Sarah had accepted Agent Vasquez's offer to serve as a consultant for the FBI's crisis response team, providing medical expertise for operations that might involve injured civilians or suspects. The additional training had expanded her skills and given her a new sense of purpose, though she maintained her primary role at Regional Medical Center. The hospital administration had been initially concerned about her involvement in dangerous situations, but the positive media coverage and recognition from federal law enforcement had ultimately worked in her favor. Jake had been awarded a commendation for the successful rescue operation, though he insisted that the real credit belonged to the entire team, and especially to Sarah's quick thinking under pressure. His military career was thriving, with prospects for promotion and increased responsibility, but he had also begun to consider what life might look like beyond his active duty service. I got a call from Carmen today, Sarah told Jake as Dolores refilled their coffee cups. The night waitress had become something of a friend to both of them, having witnessed their first meeting and taken a proprietary interest in their relationship's development. How is she doing? Jake asked. He had visited Carmen several times during her hospital stay, developing a protective affection for all the women his team had rescued. She's been accepted to community college for the spring semester. She wants to study social work so she can help other survivors navigate the system. Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar warmth that came from seeing patients not just survive, but thrive after trauma. She specifically asked me to thank you again for believing that she was worth risking your life to save. Jake shook his head. She never needed to thank me. That's what we do, right? We use our skills to help people who can't help themselves. This philosophy had become a cornerstone of their relationship. Both of them were driven by a sense of service that transcended personal ambition, and they had found in each other a partner who understood the demands and rewards of choosing a life dedicated to helping others. Sarah's sister Emma had finally met Jake during Thanksgiving dinner, and despite her initial skepticism about her sister dating someone in a dangerous profession, she had been won over by his obvious devotion to Sarah and his commitment to making the world a safer place. Emma had pulled Sarah aside after dinner to announce her approval, saying that she had never seen her sister so happy and balanced. The balance was indeed something new for Sarah. For years, she had poured all her energy into her work, using her career as both purpose and escape from the losses she had experienced. Jake's presence in her life had encouraged her to find space for personal happiness without diminishing her professional dedication. She still worked hard and took on challenging cases, but she also made time for dinners and movies and quiet conversations that had nothing to do with medical emergencies or life and death decisions. Jake had undergone a similar transformation. His teammates Santos and Reed had noticed that their commander seemed more relaxed, more willing to delegate responsibilities and take occasional leave time. The hypervigilance that had served him well in dangerous situations was beginning to ease in his personal life, allowing him to experience the simple pleasures of a relationship built on mutual respect and shared values. "I have some news," Jake said, his tone carrying a seriousness that made Sarah look up from her coffee. "I've been offered a position with a joint task force that coordinates between military special operations and civilian law enforcement. It would mean less overseas deployment and more work domestically on cases like the human trafficking operation." Sarah felt her heart skip. She had known that Jake's current assignment would eventually require extended deployments to dangerous locations around the world, and while she had been prepared to support him through those challenges, the prospect of a more stable arrangement was appealing. "What would that mean for us?" she asked, not wanting to assume too much but hoping that her feelings were as important to him as his were to her. "It would mean that I could stop thinking about our relationship in terms of deployments and time zones," Jake replied, reaching across the table to take her hand. "It would mean that I could start thinking about building something permanent, with the woman who changed my life by being exactly where I needed her when I needed her most." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She had learned during their months together that Jake Morrison was a man of few words but deep convictions. When he spoke about emotions or the future, he chose his words carefully and meant everything he said. "I love you, Sarah," he continued, his voice steady and certain. "I love your courage and your compassion and the way you make me want to be a better man. I love that you understand why my work matters to me, and I love that your work makes the world a better place every single day." "I love you too," Sarah replied, feeling the truth of those words settle into her heart like a promise. "I love that you risk everything to protect people you've never met, and I love that you came into my life at exactly the moment when I needed to remember that there's more to living than just surviving." Dolores, who had been discreetly watching their conversation from behind the counter, approached their table with a smile. "You two want some pie on the house? This seems like a pie kind of moment." They laughed, the emotional intensity breaking into the kind of comfortable affection that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. As Dolores brought them slices of apple pie, Sarah reflected on the chain of events that had brought them together. A routine shift at the hospital, a quiet coffee break, a chance encounter during a crisis that had revealed the best qualities in both of them. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been here that night?" Jake asked, as if reading her thoughts. "I think about it sometimes," Sarah admitted, "but I've learned not to spend too much time on alternate histories. The important thing is that we were both exactly where we needed to be, when we needed to be there." Jake nodded, understanding implicit in his expression. They were both people who dealt with contingency and chance as part of their professional lives, who understood that the difference between tragedy and triumph often came down to timing, preparation, and the willingness of good people to take action when action was required. As they finished their pie and prepared to leave the diner, that had become such an important part of their story, Sarah realized that her life had found a new rhythm that incorporated both her dedication to healing and her commitment to the man who had shown her that love could coexist with service, that personal happiness could enhance rather than diminish professional purpose. The future stretched before them, filled with the promise of shared challenges and mutual support, built on the foundation of a relationship that had begun when a trauma nurse off-duty and a Navy SEAL between missions had found each other in the quiet hours before dawn, united by their commitment to protecting and healing a world that desperately needed both.